The courtroom was filled with an air of tension, the kind that sits heavy in your chest, urging everyone to hold their breath. The prosecutor stood at the front, reading through a piece of evidence with a confident air, his voice cutting through the room. The defense attorney, David Harper, sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for the next move. The defendant, Mark Bennett, a man in his mid-40s, sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists as the weight of the accusations against him hung over him like a dark cloud. "Order in the court!" The judge's voice rang out sharply, echoing across the room, her gavel slamming down on the desk with an almost deafening sound. The murmurs of the audience quieted instantly, and the tension in the air seemed to grow even thicker. For a moment, there was silence. And then, just as the room seemed to settle into some semblance of order, a voice broke through the stillness. "I have something to say, Your Honor," the voice rang out from the back of the gallery. It was young, trembling, but firm in its urgency. Heads turned in shock, gasps rippled through the room. All eyes locked onto the young woman who had stood up abruptly from her seat in the back. She was thin, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, but it was her presence that commanded attention. Her eyes locked on the judge with a determination that immediately set her apart. "Sit down!" barked one of the bailiffs, rushing toward her. The gallery whispered amongst themselves, unsure of what to make of this interruption. But the woman, Emily Carter, didn't flinch. She raised her hand slowly, as though to calm the bailiff, her voice growing louder, tinged with a sense of urgency that gripped everyone's attention. "What you're about to do is wrong," she said, her voice trembling with emotion but unwavering. "You don't know the whole truth." The defense attorney, Harper, looked startled. The prosecutor's face twisted with irritation, and the judge's eyes narrowed. "Who exactly are you, young lady?" the judge demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. Emily stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze steady. She hesitated for a brief moment before she answered. "My name is Emily Carter," she said, her voice quieter now but still clear. "And I know something that could change everything." The courtroom fell silent. There was something electric in the air, something that made everyone, even the judge, lean forward in anticipation. Emily's words hung heavy in the room, and Mark Bennett, the accused man, looked up sharply, his eyes locking onto her for the first time. The prosecutor froze, a frown furrowing his brow. The judge's gavel was frozen in mid-air, her expression unreadable. "Explain yourself," the judge said sharply. "What do you know, Miss Carter?" Emily swallowed hard. Her fingers gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, her palms sweating. She looked over at Mark once more, who met her gaze with a pleading look in his eyes. She could feel the weight of his silent desperation, but she also knew that what she was about to say could change everything. "I. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. "I know who really did it." The words fell from her lips like a bomb. The room erupted into chaos, whispers, gasps, exclamations. People shifted in their seats, muttering to each other in disbelief. The bailiff rushed to grab Emily's arm, but the judge raised her hand, signaling for order. "Enough!" the judge commanded, her voice fierce. "This court will have order." Turning her sharp gaze back to Emily, the judge said, "Explain yourself." "Now." Emily felt her heart race. She looked around at the faces in the crowd, everyone watching her closely, waiting for her to say something, to explain what she knew. She could feel her knees weaken beneath her, but she stood her ground. I can't explain everything just yet," she said, her voice trembling with a sense of urgency. "But please, if you convict him without knowing this, An innocent man will go to prison. The judge's eyes sharpened, her gaze cutting through Emily like a knife. "You've put this court in an impossible position," she said, her voice cold and firm. "If you're lying, you'll be held in contempt. If you're telling the truth, this changes everything. I need answers." Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice unwavering now, despite the nerves threatening to take over. "But first, I need you to trust me. Just this once." For a long moment, the room remained silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily had been sitting quietly in the gallery for most of the day, an unassuming figure among the other spectators. She had arrived early, unsure of what she could do, but something had drawn her to this trial. The case against Mark Bennett, a man accused of stealing nearly $1 million from the charity he had spent years building, had been all over the news. The accusations were damning: greed, betrayal, and a man who had turned on the very people he had once helped. But Emily couldn't believe it. She had followed Mark's work for years, watched his charity transform her community, pulling families from poverty. Her own family had been one of them. She knew the kind of man Mark was, and she couldn't reconcile the person she knew with the accusations being leveled against him. The morning of the trial, Emily had almost stayed home. What could she do? She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a witness. She didn't even know Mark personally. But something in her gut had told her to come, even if it meant sitting quietly and observing. It wasn't until the prosecutor had presented a piece of evidence, a series of emails allegedly sent by Mark, that Emily felt her heart drop. The emails detailed plans to transfer the stolen money to an offshore account. The words were cold, calculated. The courtroom had hung on every syllable as the prosecutor read them aloud. But Emily had noticed something that no one else seemed to catch. The email address in the header was wrong. It was subtle, just a single letter off, but it was enough to make Emily's blood run cold. She knew instantly that the emails were fake. She couldn't explain why or how, but deep down, she felt it. She knew Mark was being framed. At first, she tried to convince herself that someone else would notice it. Surely the defense attorney would spot the mistake. Surely the judge or the jurors would catch it. But as the trial had progressed, it became painfully clear that no one had noticed. And if she didn't say something, no one ever would. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. Emily stood her ground, her voice trembling with both fear and determination, her mind racing with the gravity of what she was about to do. The judge's cold gaze remained fixed on her, the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on her like a 1,000-pound weight. "Miss Carter," the judge said, her voice sharp, "you've made a claim that could alter the course of this entire trial. But I need to know, what exactly is it that you've seen?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as she fought to maintain her composure. She felt every pair of eyes in the room trained on her, waiting for an answer. Her palms were clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence in the room was deafening, every sound amplified in her ears as she tried to steady herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "I was sitting in the gallery this morning, just like everyone else. I didn't come here to be a part of this trial, but I noticed something in the evidence presented by the prosecution, a detail that no one seemed to catch." Emily's eyes flickered to Mark, sitting silently at the defense table, his face a mixture of disbelief and silent pleading. He had been accused of stealing nearly $1 million from the charity he had spent years building, a charity that had pulled countless families out of poverty, including Emily's own. She couldn't believe it. She knew him, or at least the work he had done. There was no way the man she had followed for years was capable of such a crime. The prosecutor, who had been silent during Emily's outburst, shifted in his seat. He glared at her, his eyes full of contempt. "This is absurd," he muttered, barely containing his anger. "We can't allow random spectators to derail this trial with baseless claims." Emily's pulse quickened as she stood before the judge. Her mind raced, trying to think of how to explain what she had seen, how to convince them that she wasn't making wild accusations. But she had to do it. For Mark. For justice. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising with urgency, "I saw a mistake in the emails that were presented as evidence. A typo. Just one letter. But it's enough to prove that these emails are forged." The prosecutor shot up from his seat, his face twisted with anger. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his voice cold and dismissive. "This is not a valid argument. She's just a spectator, not a witness. She has no right to make such claims." The judge raised her hand, silencing the room. "Sustained," she said, her tone firm. "But Miss Carter, you claim you noticed something significant. If you're going to make this claim, you'll need to take the stand and testify under oath." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, but there was no turning back now. She had to speak the truth, no matter the consequences. Slowly, she nodded, her heart racing. The bailiff approached her, leading her toward the witness stand, and as Emily climbed the steps, she felt the eyes of the courtroom on her. Every step felt like 1,000 pounds pressing down on her chest, as she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Emily's hands trembled, her thoughts spinning. This was not how she had envisioned her day unfolding. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a professional. But somehow, she knew in her gut that what she had seen, the tiny, almost imperceptible mistake in the email address, was the key to unraveling the entire case. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice cold but curious, "you claim to have seen a typo in the email addresses presented in court. How can you be sure this is relevant?" Emily opened her mouth to speak, but she hesitated. Her mind was racing, trying to find the right words, trying to explain what she had seen without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and she suddenly felt small and insignificant. But she couldn't back down now. She had to do this, not just for Mark, but for herself. She had to stand up and speak the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. "I know this charity," Emily said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I've been following it for years. I know the official email address for Mr. Bennett's charity by heart. When I saw the email address in the evidence today, I recognized that one letter was off. The domain was wrong. There was an extra E in the official address, and the email presented in court didn't match. That's why I know these emails are fake." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once again, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The judge's eyes narrowed as she processed what Emily had just said. "Miss Carter," the judge said, her voice now laced with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, "you realize that if you're lying, there will be consequences, don't you? You'll be held in contempt of court." Emily nodded, her hands clenched tightly together in her lap. "I know, Your Honor," she said, her voice firm now, "but I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth." The judge sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the room remained still, the tension palpable. Emily could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a vice. "You're asking this court to believe you based on a single typo," the judge said slowly, her gaze intense. And you expect me to take your word for it without more proof? Emily felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She had to make them see what she saw. She couldn't let Mark go to prison for something he didn't do. The truth had to come out. "I've been following Mark's work for years," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I know what he's done for this community. I know what his charity has done. He didn't steal that money. Someone's trying to frame him, and I'm the only one who's seen it. Please, Your Honor, if you convict him without knowing this, an innocent man will go to prison." The judge's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Emily to catch it. For the briefest moment, Emily saw something more than skepticism in the judge's eyes. She saw a flicker of doubt, a hint of something that made her believe, just for a moment, that she might have a chance. "I'll allow the defense to review the evidence," the judge finally said, her voice firm. "But Miss Carter, if you're lying, I will hold you in contempt of court. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, her stomach twisting with nerves. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly. The judge's gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the session. The courtroom erupted into chaos as people started talking amongst themselves, their voices overlapping in a blur of excitement and disbelief. Emily was led back to her seat by the bailiff, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. The chaos in the courtroom was palpable, like a storm swirling just beneath the surface, ready to explode. Emily felt her body go numb as the weight of what had just transpired sank in. Her pulse raced, the aftershocks of her bold confession reverberating through her chest. She had taken the stand, had made a claim that could alter the entire trial, but the gravity of the situation hadn't hit her until now. She was no longer just a spectator. She had crossed the line into something far bigger than herself. Her mind raced as the room buzzed with murmurs. The prosecutor shot glares in her direction, his face a mask of disdain. The defense attorney, David Harper, gave her a quick nod of approval, though the weight of what had happened still hung between them like a thick fog. He seemed to be as unsure of the outcome as she was. Emily's thoughts, however, were fixed on one thing: the emails. The emails that had been presented as irrefutable evidence against Mark Bennett. The emails that she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, had been forged. And no one else had seen it. No one else had caught the small but crucial detail that would change everything: the single, almost invisible typo in the email domain. She had seen it the moment the prosecutor began reading aloud the damning words, the moment the evidence had been displayed in front of the entire courtroom. The emails were supposed to show Mark's involvement in transferring stolen money from his charity's account to an offshore account. The prosecutor's voice had been filled with certainty as he read the cold, calculated words, each sentence painting Mark as a man consumed by greed. But Emily had noticed something different. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail that everyone else had missed: the email address. The domain didn't match. It had been subtle, but it was enough for Emily to know that something was wrong. That detail, that small error in the header, had revealed a much larger truth. The emails were fake. They were carefully crafted to frame Mark for a crime he hadn't committed. But why? Who would go to such lengths to ruin his life? As she sat back in her seat, her thoughts turned over the possibilities. She had no concrete proof, no direct evidence that could unravel the entire case in one go. But she knew, deep in her gut, that Mark had been framed, and now it was up to her to find the truth. The bailiff's voice broke through her thoughts. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "the judge wants to see you." Emily stood up slowly, her legs shaky as she followed the bailiff toward the side of the courtroom. Her heart raced with each step, but this time it wasn't fear. It was resolve. She was going to see this through, no matter the cost. This wasn't just about clearing Mark's name anymore. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring that justice was served. As she entered the judge's chambers, she was greeted by the sight of the judge seated at her desk, papers scattered in front of her. The judge's face was unreadable, her eyes scanning through the documents in front of her. When Emily entered, the judge looked up, her sharp gaze cutting through the silence. "Miss Carter," the judge said, her voice measured, "you've made quite a claim today. I need you to explain in detail what you saw." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had already spoken about the emails in court, but now she had to convince the judge that she was telling the truth. This was her chance to prove that Mark's innocence was more than just a hunch. It was the key to unraveling a larger conspiracy. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice steadier now, "I know the official email address for Mr. Bennett's charity. I've seen it dozens of times. When I saw the emails that were presented as evidence today, I immediately noticed that one of the addresses was wrong. It was subtle, just one letter off, but it was enough to make me realize that the emails had been forged. They weren't real." The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "And you're certain of this?" Emily nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm certain." The judge's gaze softened for a brief moment before she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Very well," the judge said, her voice thoughtful. "You've made a compelling argument, Miss Carter. But you must understand that this court operates on facts and evidence. If you are wrong, the consequences could be severe. If you are right, however, this could change everything." Emily swallowed hard. The weight of the judge's words settled heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just a matter of presenting evidence anymore. This was about trusting her instincts, and it was a risk that could cost her everything. "I understand, Your Honor," Emily said softly, "but I'm not wrong. I know what I saw." The judge remained silent for a moment, her fingers drumming against the desk. Finally, she spoke. "I will allow a brief recess for the defense and prosecution to review the evidence. Miss Carter, you are to remain in the building. I'll make a decision shortly." With that, the judge dismissed her, and Emily was led back to the gallery. Her mind was spinning as she sat back down, her body shaking from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was just the beginning. The judge had given them a chance to present their case, but it wasn't over yet. The prosecution was not going to go down without a fight. As she sat in her seat, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced around the courtroom, her eyes scanning the faces of the spectators, the defense team, and the prosecutor. But everyone seemed too focused on the task at hand to pay her any mind. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered, gnawing at the back of her mind. It wasn't until the recess was called that she realized how much the tension had begun to wear on her. The courtroom emptied as everyone took their break, but Emily remained seated, her hands trembling as she waited for the next phase of the trial. David Harper, the defense attorney, walked over to her, his face serious but kind. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "what you've done today is brave, but you need to be careful. There's a lot at stake here, and there are people who don't want the truth to come out." Emily nodded, her thoughts racing. She knew the stakes were high. But for Mark, for the community that had supported him, and for herself, she couldn't back down now. As the bailiff called for everyone to return to their seats, Emily stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't over yet. They were just getting started, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was still abuzz as the recess came to an end. Emily sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap as she tried to steady her racing heart. The weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. It had been a huge gamble, standing up in front of everyone and making the claim that the emails were forged. She had put herself out there, risked everything for a man she barely knew. But she couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. She had seen the truth, and she couldn't sit idly by while an innocent man was being condemned. The prosecutor, whose name was Caldwell, paced at the front of the room, talking quietly with his team. Emily caught glimpses of his angry gestures, his frustration palpable. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a random spectator. The defense attorney, David Harper, stood by quietly, scribbling notes in his legal pad. He didn't seem to be looking at the people around him, instead lost in his thoughts as he processed what had just happened. Emily's thoughts, however, were fixed on the emails. She had examined them over and over in her mind. The tiny typo in the domain name was a clear sign that someone had faked them. And if they were fake, then everything about the prosecution's case fell apart. But why? Who would go to such lengths to frame Mark Bennett? It made no sense. Mark had dedicated his life to his charity, a charity that had pulled countless families, including Emily's own, from the brink of poverty. She tried to push the doubts aside. It was too late to turn back now. She had to trust her instincts. As the courtroom filled back up and everyone took their seats, the tension in the air was palpable. The judge entered, her gaze scanning the room as the gavel struck. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the next move. Emily held her breath as the judge began speaking. "We have reviewed the information you've provided, Miss Carter," the judge said, her voice stern but with an undercurrent of curiosity. "It's an interesting claim, but we need more than just a typo. We need concrete evidence that the emails were forged and that they're part of a larger conspiracy." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she nodded. She understood. She had already made her case, but now it was up to the defense and prosecution to examine the evidence she had pointed out. Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited, every second stretching longer than the last. It was then that something unexpected happened. A figure appeared in the doorway, stepping into the courtroom with urgency. A man in a dark suit, his face a mask of determination. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, his eyes scanning the room. The bailiff approached him, but the man held up his hand in a silent gesture, making it clear that he wasn't going to wait for permission. "I have evidence that will change everything," the man said, his voice calm but intense. His words were directed at the judge, but they carried enough weight to make the entire courtroom turn their attention to him. The murmurs started immediately, rippling through the room like a shock wave. Everyone in the courtroom, from the defense team to the prosecutor, turned to look at this mysterious new player. Emily blinked in surprise, her mind racing. Who was this man? What kind of evidence did he have? And why was he so confident that it would change everything? The judge raised an eyebrow, her attention fully on the new arrival. "And who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp with authority. The man took a deep breath, then answered. "My name is Robert Hayes," he said, his tone steady. "I'm a private investigator, and I've been working on this case for weeks. I have evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's claims." The courtroom was thrown into chaos once again. The prosecutor's face twisted in anger, and the defense team exchanged confused glances. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Was this the breakthrough they needed? Was this the evidence that could finally prove Mark's innocence? "Objection!" the prosecutor shouted, standing up abruptly. "This is highly irregular. We can't allow random people to just walk in and present evidence. This trial has already been thrown off course enough by Miss Carter's claims. We can't allow any more distractions." The judge's gaze remained steely, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she looked at Robert Hayes. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice measured, "if you have evidence to present, you will need to do so properly. This court operates on facts and procedure." Robert nodded, unfazed by the prosecutor's outburst. "I understand, Your Honor," he said, "but the evidence I have is crucial. It's not just about the emails. It's about the financial records, about the money that's been moved around. I can prove that Mark Bennett was framed, and I can prove who's behind it." The prosecutor's face turned red with frustration. "Your Honor," he snapped, "this is absurd. The defense is trying to delay the trial with baseless claims. We don't need another sideshow." The judge held up her hand, silencing the room. "Enough," she said firmly. "Mr. Hayes, if you have evidence, you will present it. But let me make one thing clear. This court will not tolerate any more interruptions. If your evidence is valid, we will review it. If not, you will be held in contempt." Robert nodded once again, his gaze steady. He walked to the front of the courtroom, taking a folder from his briefcase and handing it to the bailiff. "This is the evidence," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I've been investigating this case for weeks. I've uncovered a trail of financial records, forged documents, and correspondence that points directly to someone else. Not Mark Bennett." Emily's heart skipped a beat as she watched the judge take the folder from the bailiff. She had never met Robert before, but in that moment, she felt like he was her ally, someone who might finally be able to expose the truth. The judge flipped through the folder, her face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the rustling of papers. The silence was excruciating. Emily could feel her chest tighten, her anxiety creeping up. Would this evidence be enough? Would Robert's claims hold water? Finally, the judge spoke. "This is significant," she said slowly, her voice measured. "Mr. Hayes, where did you obtain this information?" Robert stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "I was hired by a concerned party who believed Mark Bennett was being framed. I've uncovered a financial trail that links this case to a network of shell companies, forged documents, and offshore accounts. The real perpetrator has been working behind the scenes, and I can prove it." The room fell into a heavy silence. The weight of Robert's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The prosecutor glared at Robert, his anger barely contained. "This is a waste of time," he spat. "The defense is just grasping at straws. We've already shown that Mark Bennett is guilty." The judge turned to him, her expression cold. "Mr. Caldwell," she said sharply, "I've heard enough from you. Mr. Hayes, if you believe this information is relevant, I will allow a brief recess for all parties to examine the evidence. But let me make it clear, if this is a distraction, there will be consequences." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the session. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity as everyone began to process the new developments. Emily's mind raced as she tried to absorb everything that had just happened. A private investigator had walked into the courtroom and presented evidence that could change the entire course of the trial. Her heart raced with both hope and fear. This could be the moment they'd been waiting for, or it could be the beginning of a much darker path. She glanced at Mark, who sat at the defense table, his face a mixture of disbelief and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, he looked like he believed that maybe, just maybe, the truth would come out. But there was still so much they didn't know. The game had just changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge called for a brief recess. The gavel had struck, the session adjourned, and the room was filled with people murmuring among themselves, processing what had just transpired. Emily remained seated, her mind racing. She had known, deep down, that someone had to be behind the conspiracy to frame Mark Bennett. But hearing Robert Hayes confirm it in such a direct and confident manner was both a relief and a weight she hadn't fully expected. Beside her, David Harper, the defense attorney, had returned to his desk, scribbling down notes rapidly. His face was a mask of concentration, but Emily could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. He had been working tirelessly on this case, but now things were shifting. He knew that what Robert had just presented could be the breakthrough they needed. But how much time did they have before the prosecution came back with an even stronger counterattack? Emily glanced at Mark, who sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clenched into fists. His face was pale, his eyes distant. Emily had no idea what was going through his mind at that moment. He had been accused of betraying the very people he had fought so hard to help. Emily couldn't imagine the kind of pressure he must have been under. But she also knew that he had been a part of something much bigger than anyone realized. The judge had been clear. All parties would need to examine the evidence, and then the court would reconvene. But what was Robert's evidence exactly? What had he uncovered that could change everything? The folder that he had handed to the bailiff had been thick, filled with financial records and correspondence that Emily hadn't had a chance to read. But Robert had insisted it was crucial, that it connected the dots to someone else, the real criminal. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to focus. There was no time to waste. She had to find out more about this mystery. Who was behind the forgery of the emails? Why had Mark been framed? And, most importantly, what did Robert know about the shell companies and offshore accounts that had been hidden in plain sight? The courtroom doors swung open, and Robert stepped inside, his face drawn but determined. He spotted Emily in the gallery and made his way toward her, his long strides purposeful. He was carrying a stack of files, and his eyes were scanning the room, making sure no one was following him. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, his voice low, but there was a sense of urgency in it. "We don't have much time. I need you to come with me. There's something you need to see." Emily felt her stomach flip. What had he found? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had said. Whatever it was, it seemed important, crucial even. She stood up quickly, following Robert as he led her out of the courtroom and into a nearby hallway. The air was thick with tension, the hum of conversations and footsteps fading into the background as they walked. Once they were out of sight of the courtroom, Robert turned to her, his face grim. "I've been digging into the financial records," he said. "What I've found is enough to blow this case wide open. Mark's being framed, and the people behind it aren't just some small-time crooks. They're powerful. They've been using Mark as a scapegoat to cover up something much bigger." Emily felt a wave of relief mixed with fear wash over her. It was what she had suspected all along, that there was something much deeper at play than just a simple embezzlement case. But hearing Robert say it out loud made it all feel more real, more urgent. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's behind this?" Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her a few papers from the stack he was carrying. "Look at these," he said. "I've traced the money. It all leads back to a series of offshore accounts, shell companies, and I'm willing to bet that the person who orchestrated this is someone who's been involved with Mark's charity from the beginning. Someone who has the means to cover their tracks." Emily's hands trembled as she looked over the papers. The numbers were staggering, large sums of money being transferred between accounts with no clear purpose. But as she scanned the records more carefully, she began to see the pattern. There were a few familiar names, and then there was one that caught her attention. The name of a company that she recognized, Haven Enterprises. She looked up at Robert. "I've seen this name before," she said, her heart racing. Haven Enterprises. It's in one of the charity newsletters. They made a donation not too long ago. Why would they be connected to these transactions? Robert's face darkened as he nodded. "I thought the same thing," he said. "Haven Enterprises is a shell company. It's part of a network of companies used to funnel money, launder it, and hide it. Whoever is behind these operations is very good at covering their tracks. But they made a mistake. They left a trail, and I've been following it." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think someone from Mark's charity is behind this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm starting to think that way," Robert said, his eyes hard. "I can't prove it yet, but I have a feeling that Haven Enterprises is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And whoever's behind it is trying to frame Mark to cover their tracks." Emily nodded, her mind racing. She had to know more. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we stop this?" Robert paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the papers in his hands. "We need to dig deeper. We need to find out who owns Haven Enterprises, who's behind these shell companies, and why they've decided to target Mark. But we don't have much time. The prosecution will be back soon, and they'll do everything they can to shut this down." Emily felt a sense of urgency settle in her chest. She knew they couldn't afford to waste any time. But as Robert's words sank in, something else began to gnaw at her. Something she hadn't been able to shake since she first stood up in the courtroom and made her claim. She had been watched. There was no denying it. The feeling had been growing since she had first set foot in the courthouse. She had seen the glances exchanged between the prosecutor and some of the other people in the room. And now, with Robert's investigation pointing to powerful people behind this scheme, Emily knew that they were in even more danger than she had realized. "Robert," she said slowly, "I need to know something. I've been getting the feeling that someone is watching me, following me. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm scared." Robert's expression darkened, his face hardening with concern. "You're not imagining things," he said, his voice grim. "If you've been followed, it's not a coincidence. Whoever is behind this is watching us. We need to be careful, Miss Carter. We've already stirred the hornet's nest, and it won't be long before they start making moves to stop us." Emily nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. They were in this together now, and there was no turning back. "Let's keep going," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that was creeping into her chest. "Let's finish this, no matter what it takes." The courthouse hummed with activity as the recess came to an end, and the familiar tension in the air returned with full force. The doors opened with a creak, and the judge entered, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her gavel struck the bench with finality, signaling the return to proceedings. Emily took a deep breath as she sat back in her seat, the weight of the moment settling around her. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom upon her. The next steps in this trial would determine everything. Beside her, Robert sat quietly, scanning through the files he had brought with him. His face was more focused than ever, and the expression in his eyes was one of determination. But there was something else there, something that Emily couldn't quite place. It was the same feeling she had gotten the moment they had realized the scope of the conspiracy they were up against. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to back down without a fight. And as the prosecution returned to their seat, their faces set with grim resolve, Emily could sense that they were gearing up for an even bigger push. The judge called for the court to reconvene, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "We will now resume the trial," she said, her tone neutral but commanding. "The defense has presented evidence of a potential discrepancy in the emails and the financial records. We will now allow the prosecution time to review and respond to this new evidence." The prosecutor Caldwell stood up, his face tight with frustration. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with disdain, "this is nothing more than an attempt to distract the court from the obvious guilt of the defendant. These claims are baseless. We have shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mark Bennett is guilty of embezzlement, and we will not allow the defense to derail this case with wild accusations." The judge turned her gaze on him, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Caldwell," she said firmly, "you will refrain from personal attacks. This court operates on facts, not assumptions. The evidence will be reviewed, and any new developments will be taken into account. Now, please proceed with your response to the defense's claims." Caldwell's face reddened with anger, but he forced himself to remain composed. "We have no need to waste time with more distractions," he said coldly. "The evidence is clear. Mark Bennett is guilty, and we are prepared to prove it." Emily watched as the prosecutor sat down, his words carrying weight. His confidence was palpable, but Emily wasn't ready to back down. She had already seen the cracks in his case, and Robert's evidence had only confirmed her suspicions. There was a far deeper conspiracy at play, one that used Mark as a pawn to cover up something much more sinister. As the court adjourned for a short break, Emily stepped outside into the cool air, trying to clear her mind. Robert had given her some new information that she could barely process. They had uncovered a series of financial records linked to Haven Enterprises, and it seemed that someone high up in the charity was pulling the strings. But even with this new evidence, they still didn't know who exactly was behind the plot. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, taking in the surroundings. The building was imposing, its tall stone columns casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. It was hard to believe that within those walls, a man's future hung in the balance. She glanced at Robert, who had stepped out beside her. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the street, as if he was waiting for something. "We need to move fast," Robert said, his voice low. "We've got the evidence, but if Caldwell or anyone else catches wind of what we've found, they'll move to discredit it. We have to get ahead of them." Emily nodded, the urgency in his voice matching the growing sense of unease in her chest. "What's the next step?" she asked. "How do we get this in front of the judge?" "We need to connect the dots," Robert said. "Haven Enterprises is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to find out who's behind it, and why Mark was chosen to take the fall. The money has been funneled through too many channels for it to be just a simple act of greed. There's a bigger scheme at play here." Emily's mind raced as she processed Robert's words. Whoever was behind this had been careful. They had covered their tracks, moving the money through multiple accounts and shell companies. But there had to be something they had missed, some small detail that would expose the truth. Emily was determined to find it. "How do we dig deeper without getting caught?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "We've already been noticed. What if they come after us?" Robert met her gaze, his eyes full of resolve. "We'll be careful," he said. "But we can't stop now. This is bigger than both of us, and the more we uncover, the more dangerous it becomes. But we have to see this through." As they walked back into the courthouse, Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had always believed in justice, in the idea that the truth would eventually come to light. But now, the fight for justice had become something personal. She wasn't just standing up for Mark. She was standing up against powerful forces that didn't want the truth exposed. And she knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. Back in the courtroom, Emily sat back down, her mind focused on the task ahead. The judge was about to speak, and she could feel the tension building in the room once again. The defense had presented its case, but the prosecution wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. "Mr. Harper," the judge called, her voice calm but firm, "you may now present your response to the prosecution's claims." David Harper stood up, his face set with determination. "Your Honor," he began, "we've presented evidence that raises serious doubts about the authenticity of the prosecution's case. The emails presented as evidence have been proven to be fraudulent, and we've uncovered a network of shell companies used to launder the stolen funds. These actions have been orchestrated by someone within Mark Bennett's own charity, and we believe that Mark has been framed for a crime he did not commit." The courtroom fell silent. Emily's heart raced as she watched the prosecutor's face contort with rage. He wasn't ready to give up, but neither was she. The judge's gaze remained steady as she listened to David's words. She was processing the new evidence carefully, weighing the gravity of the situation. Emily knew that this was their moment. They had to make the judge see what they had uncovered. The conspiracy was real, and it was up to them to bring it into the light. As the gavel came down again, signaling the start of the next phase of the trial, Emily's pulse quickened. The game had changed, and now it was all or nothing. The courtroom was a battleground, the tension hanging thick in the air as the gavel struck once more. Emily's heart raced as she sat in the gallery, watching the defense and prosecution continue their heated exchange. David Harper had just presented their case, and the weight of the evidence had shifted the course of the trial in a way that no one had anticipated. But the battle was far from over. The prosecution was determined to push forward, and Emily knew that they had only scratched the surface of a much larger conspiracy. As the trial continued, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the whispers of suspicion and intrigue circulating among the spectators. Emily tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to the overwhelming weight of what they had uncovered. There were shell companies, offshore accounts, and forged financial records, elements of a scheme that went far beyond the simple embezzlement charge Mark Bennett was facing. Whoever was behind this had worked carefully, covering their tracks with precision. And now, with the prosecution on the defensive, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching them. She had known, from the very moment she had stood up in the courtroom and revealed the discrepancy in the emails, that she was walking a dangerous path. But nothing had prepared her for the growing sense of unease that had taken root in her chest. She had received a series of mysterious phone calls, text messages, and now, just as the trial was heating up, she had started noticing strange figures lurking near the courthouse. It wasn't just paranoia. She had seen them. The men in dark suits who had been following her from a distance. They hadn't made any overt moves, but their presence was undeniable. She could feel their eyes on her, always just out of sight, always watching. Emily had always prided herself on being able to trust her instincts, and right now her instincts were screaming that they were in grave danger. Robert Hayes had noticed it too. He had been quiet for the past few days, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every street, as they walked to and from the courthouse. He had kept his concerns to himself, but Emily could tell that the weight of the situation was wearing on him. He wasn't just an investigator. He was now deeply involved in a case that had the potential to unravel the lives of many powerful people. People who didn't take kindly to being exposed. After the latest round of testimony, Emily and Robert had stepped out for a brief break. They stood near the courthouse steps, trying to clear their minds before they returned to face whatever new developments awaited them inside. The air outside was cool, the city streets bustling with activity. But despite the distractions, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Robert," she said, her voice low, "do you feel it too?" "We're being watched." He glanced around quickly, his eyes narrowing. "I do," he said quietly, "and I don't like it. There's too much at stake now. We've made some powerful enemies, and they won't let this go easily." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do we do?" she asked, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. "How do we keep moving forward without putting ourselves in even more danger?" Robert's jaw tightened as he scanned the street. "We keep our heads down," he said, his voice steady but full of concern. "But we also need to be ready for anything. Whoever's behind this will stop at nothing to silence us." Just as Robert spoke, Emily caught a glimpse of a man standing across the street. He was watching them intently, his expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, he quickly turned away and disappeared into the crowd. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She was sure it wasn't the first time they had crossed paths. She had seen him before, lurking in the shadows, always just out of sight. "That's him," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've seen him before." Robert stiffened. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "Don't let anyone get too close. We need to get back inside before this gets worse." They quickly moved back toward the courthouse, the weight of the unknown hanging over them. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the man she had seen. Who was he? Why was he watching them? And more importantly, who had sent him? As they re-entered the courthouse, the heavy atmosphere inside seemed to press down on Emily even more. The trial had resumed, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the strange encounter outside. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily sat through the proceedings, her mind not fully on the trial, but on the growing sense of unease that had taken root in her chest. Robert sat beside her, his focus unwavering, but Emily could tell that he was just as concerned as she was. They both knew that they were reaching a critical point in the trial. But now, with the increasing presence of shadowy figures, Emily began to wonder if they were in over their heads. By the time the court session ended for the day, Emily's nerves were on edge. She had never felt so vulnerable. As she and Robert walked out of the courthouse together, they were met by the harsh, cold light of the street lamps. But even as they made their way toward Robert's car, the feeling of being followed never left. It was as though the darkness had eyes, watching every move they made. When they arrived at the car, Robert stopped for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. "I think it's time we had a talk," he said, his voice low and serious. "There are people watching us, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Emily swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We keep going," Robert said firmly, his eyes filled with resolve. "But we need to be careful. We have to make sure we stay one step ahead. If they think they can intimidate us into silence, they're wrong." As Emily got into the car, her heart heavy with the weight of Robert's words, she realized just how far they had come, and just how much more they had yet to face. The stakes had never been higher, and the threat of danger loomed closer with each passing day. But Emily knew that there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and she was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it cost her. The following days dragged on like a fog, each one heavier than the last. The trial had taken a new turn, and while the evidence they had uncovered seemed undeniable, Emily felt the walls of uncertainty closing in around her. The unease she had felt since stepping into the courtroom seemed to grow with every passing hour. Everywhere she went, it seemed like someone was watching, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. Robert had been equally on edge. They had spent the past few days going over the new evidence, financial records, offshore accounts, and emails that linked several high-powered individuals to the scheme against Mark Bennett. The more they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. Emily's instincts screamed at her that the people behind this were watching them, tracking every move they made. She couldn't help but feel the weight of their attention, even when they were inside the safety of Robert's office or the courthouse. On one particularly long evening, after another grueling session in court, Robert asked Emily to meet him at his office. He had something important to discuss. As Emily made her way there, her thoughts were consumed by the mounting pressure. The prosecution had been relentless, but with each new piece of evidence that was uncovered, their case seemed to crumble. Yet, despite their apparent success, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. When she arrived, she found Robert pacing in his office, papers scattered around him. He looked up as she entered, his face grim. "I've been looking into Haven Enterprises again," Robert said, his voice low. "I found something we missed the first time." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the growing sense of dread. Robert handed her a set of documents, his hands clenched into fists. "This company, Haven Enterprises, has ties to some of the most powerful players in the charity and business world. But there's more. I've traced the financial transactions back to an individual named Victor Nash. He's been laundering money through these accounts, and I believe he's the key to everything." Emily scanned the documents, her mind racing. She had heard the name before. Victor Nash. He had been the one behind the scenes, pulling the strings. He was the person who had orchestrated the framing of Mark Bennett. The more Emily read, the more she understood the complexity of the web they had uncovered. Nash wasn't just involved in one aspect of the operation. He was deeply embedded in it, running the show from the shadows. "What now?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the overwhelming weight of the situation. "Do we have enough to bring him down?" Robert's eyes darkened. "I think we do. But there's still one problem. Nash has an army of people who are loyal to him. He's not going down without a fight, and he won't hesitate to make us disappear if he thinks we're a threat." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "So, what do we do?" "We need to go public," Robert said, his voice resolute. "We need to expose Nash and his connections before he can cover his tracks. But we need to move fast. If he gets wind of what we've found, he'll try to stop us." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of Robert's words. They were in deeper than they had ever realized. They were no longer just fighting for Mark's freedom. They were fighting to expose an entire criminal network, a network that spanned far beyond what they had imagined. And now, they were a part of that fight. But even as they prepared to take their next steps, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It had become impossible to ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to follow them. Unmarked cars parked outside their offices, shadowy figures in the distance who disappeared the moment they turned to look. Emily felt like a target, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. That night, as they prepared to meet with their trusted contact in law enforcement to discuss the next steps, something happened that Emily had feared all along. She received a text message from an unknown number. "Stay out of this. It's bigger than you think." The words sent a jolt of fear through her. She had been warned before, But this message felt different, more personal. Her hands trembled as she read it again. Who was it from? And why had they decided to target her now? Before she could process the message further, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Robert. "Emily," he said urgently, "we need to meet." Now. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her thoughts a blur of fear and uncertainty. As she made her way to Robert's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but the streets were dark, empty. Still, the sense of being watched was palpable. It was as though every corner held a new threat. When she arrived at Robert's office, he was pacing, his face etched with concern. "I've received some intel," he said quickly. "Nash knows we're onto him, and he's making moves to shut us down." Emily's heart raced. "What do we do?" "We go on the offensive," Robert said, his voice sharp. "We take this information to the authorities, and we go public. We can't let Nash cover his tracks, but we need to be ready for anything. He won't play fair." Just as Robert finished speaking, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. Emily's mind raced as she turned to face the door. Was it someone they could trust? Or had Nash's men finally found them? Robert's face darkened as he moved toward the door. He opened it slowly, his hand resting on the knob. The moment the door cracked open, a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by shadows. Emily's heart skipped a beat as he spoke. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, his voice cold and clipped, "we need to talk." Robert stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the desk. "This is your last warning," he said quietly. "Stay out of it. You're digging in places you shouldn't be." Emily's stomach churned as she watched Robert's expression shift from one of suspicion to one of resolve. "And if we don't?" Robert asked, his voice low. The man didn't flinch. "Then you'll be next." With that, he turned and walked out of the office, disappearing into the shadows. Emily stared at the envelope in front of her, her mind reeling. The warning was clear. Whoever was behind this was willing to do anything to protect their secrets. And now, she and Robert had become the target. The envelope on the desk lay ominously between them. The weight of it seemed to crush the air out of the room, the unspoken threat hanging in the silence. Emily glanced at Robert, who was already opening it, his face tense but resolute. There was no turning back now. They had reached a point where they could either back down and let the powerful forces at play silence them, or they could press forward, risking everything to expose the truth. Robert pulled out a single sheet of paper and scanned it quickly before handing it to Emily. It was a typed note, written in simple, direct language. "Stay away from this case, or the consequences will be severe. You have been warned." Emily felt the blood drain from her face as she read the words. The threat was unmistakable. They were not only fighting a corrupt network, they were fighting for their lives. The moment they had decided to stand up against Victor Nash and his network of powerful allies, they had crossed a line. The note was a warning, but it was more than that. It was a statement of intent. "This is it," Robert said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "They're not just trying to intimidate us. They want us to back off completely. And if we don't, they'll go after us. No questions asked." Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she set the note down. "We've come this far, Robert. We can't stop now. If we back down, we're giving them everything they want. Mark will lose, and the truth will never come out." Robert's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. I know. I just want to make sure we're prepared. Whoever sent this knows what we're up against, and they're willing to play dirty. We need to be one step ahead. The air in the room felt heavier than ever, the stakes higher than they had imagined when they first uncovered the truth. But Emily had already made up her mind. They couldn't stop. The evidence they had, the information they had gathered, it was too important. The fight for justice had become something much bigger than Mark's case. It was about dismantling an entire network of corruption, about standing up to people who thought they could control everything, even the law. But there was still so much to do. They had gathered the evidence, but now they had to move quickly. If they were going to expose Nash and his network, they needed to act before the people behind the conspiracy could silence them. "We need to take this to the authorities," Emily said, her voice firm. "We can't wait any longer. We need to get this in front of the judge and make sure everything is on the record. If we can bring Nash to trial, we'll have the leverage we need." Robert nodded, though his eyes were shadowed with worry. "I agree, but we need to be careful. If Nash finds out, we're done for. He'll do anything to protect himself and his people." Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for the next move. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. They had to go all in. "Let's do it. We have the evidence. We know what's been going on. It's time we showed the world the truth." They spent the next few hours finalizing everything. Robert had managed to secure a meeting with one of his trusted contacts in law enforcement, a detective who had been helping them with the case. The meeting would be critical. They needed to present the evidence and get the authorities involved before Nash could take any more drastic actions. As they drove to the meeting location, Emily's mind raced. The note from earlier still weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't afford to be distracted. They had one shot at this, and they had to make it count. If they failed now, Mark's case would be sealed, and the powerful people behind this conspiracy would go unpunished. When they arrived at the meeting, they were led into a small, dimly lit room. A detective named Karen Mitchell was waiting for them. She was a no-nonsense type of person, tall, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Emily recognized her immediately from their previous conversations. "Robert," Karen said, her voice low but full of authority. "Emily, good to see you both. What's the latest?" Robert wasted no time, pulling out the folder filled with evidence. He set it on the table, opening it to reveal the financial records, the forged emails, and the connection to Haven Enterprises. He laid out everything they had uncovered, explaining the timeline of the fraudulent transactions and the people involved. Karen listened intently, her eyes flicking over the documents as she absorbed the information. When Robert finished, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "This is big," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. "This isn't just about embezzlement anymore. You've got connections to a lot of high-level people here. Whoever's behind this isn't going to go down without a fight." Emily nodded. "We've already received a threat. Someone's watching us. We're in too deep now. But we have to make sure this gets exposed. We can't let them cover it up." Karen studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I agree. But we need to move fast. If we can verify this information, we might be able to get a warrant for Victor Nash. But we'll need more evidence. We need to know who else is involved and how far this goes." Robert spoke up, his voice filled with urgency. "We've connected Nash to Haven Enterprises, and we've traced the money to offshore accounts. But we need someone inside, someone who can help us get the full picture." Karen tapped her fingers on the table thoughtfully. "I know a few people who might be able to help, but we'll need to act quickly. If they find out we're onto them, they'll bury this case faster than you can blink." Emily's stomach tightened with the weight of the danger they were facing. They were about to make their move, and the stakes had never been higher. She couldn't afford to back down now, no matter how much danger she was in. "We can't wait," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to rise within her. "We need to act now." Karen nodded, a steely determination in her eyes. "All right, let's do this." As they left the meeting, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made up her mind. They were going to expose Victor Nash, take down the network of corruption, and clear Mark's name. The final push was about to begin. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The team they had assembled worked tirelessly behind the scenes to verify every piece of evidence. They were running out of time. The walls were closing in on them, and with every passing moment, it felt like the powerful figures behind this conspiracy were growing more desperate. Emily could feel the tension in her chest as she walked into Robert's office, where he was pacing. "Everything's ready," Robert said, his voice firm but strained. "Karen has her contacts working on the financials, and we've got the evidence. Now we just need to get this in front of the judge." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the final push. "Let's do it. We can't waste any more time." As they arrived at the courthouse, the familiar weight of anxiety pressed down on her again. She had never felt more vulnerable, but she had also never been more determined. The trial was entering its final phase, and this was their last chance to expose the truth. Mark's fate, the fate of so many others involved in this web of lies and corruption, depended on what happened next. The courtroom was quiet as they entered. Mark sat at the defense table looking worn but hopeful. His lawyer, David Harper, was already in deep discussion with the judge. Emily and Robert made their way to their seats, their nerves taut with the weight of what was about to unfold. After a tense silence, the judge called for order. The prosecution had already prepared its response, but now it was the defense's turn to present the final piece of the puzzle. David stood up, his face a mask of focus and resolve. "Your Honor," David began, "we have new evidence that not only exonerates my client, Mark Bennett, but also implicates the true criminals behind this operation. This evidence has been painstakingly gathered, verified, and corroborated by law enforcement professionals. It includes financial records, forged emails, and a network of corruption spanning high-powered individuals who believed they could silence the truth." The courtroom was still as the judge reviewed the new evidence presented. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the judge flipped through the pages of the folder. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Robert's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Finally, the judge looked up. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, met the prosecutor's, then flicked to Emily and Robert. "This evidence is significant," the judge said slowly, her voice firm. "It paints a picture of a conspiracy far larger than originally thought. A conspiracy that implicates more than just Mr. Bennett." Emily's heart soared. They were being heard. They had done it. The prosecutor, Caldwell, stood up in protest, but the judge held up her hand, silencing him. "I will allow the defense's new evidence to be considered, and I will order a full investigation into the matters presented. This court will recess until further notice while the authorities review the evidence." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled to get the story, and murmurs of disbelief spread like wildfire. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was it. They had brought the truth to light. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, Emily and Robert exchanged a glance. They had done it. The battle wasn't over, but they had won the first crucial victory. Outside the courtroom, Mark came up to them, his face filled with gratitude. I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice trembling. "You've saved me. You've given me my life back." Emily smiled, her heart lightening. "We didn't just do it for you, Mark. We did it for everyone who believed in you." Robert nodded, his expression serious, but filled with quiet pride. "The real work is just beginning. There's still a lot to uncover. But we've made it clear. We won't back down." And as they stepped out of the courthouse into the bright light of a new day, Emily felt a surge of hope. The truth had won, but the fight for justice was far from over. She and Robert had brought the darkness to light, and together they would continue the fight for as long as it took. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she could finally breathe. The shadows that had haunted them were starting to recede, and the truth was on their side.